glorious and very beautiful, but Trixie preferred the little white frame house where she lived with her 3 brothers and their parents. "I hope we'll always be neighbors," she said to Honey. "I would have died of loneliness last summer if your father hadn't bought the manor house. There was just no one around to talk to. Brian and Mart were away at camp, and there was nobody left but Bobby. You can't do things with him, just keep him out of trouble, if possible, and wash his face and comb his hair and bandage his scraped knees. That's not a very exciting way to spend a summer, let me tell you." "I know someone who's dying of loneliness right now," Honey said, "and I feel awfully sorry for her." "Who?" Trixie asked curiously. With the exception of Honey, she had gone to grade school with all of the boys and girls who had entered junior high that September. She couldn't think of one of them who had any reason for being lonely. Most of them lived in the pretty residential section of the town, which sprawled along the east bank of the Hudson River. Because they lived so near one another, they had grand times after school and during the holidays, whereas almost all of the bus children were separated from their friends by miles or at least acres. "Who?" Trixie asked again. "Diana Lynch," Honey said, whispering. "Die? Lonely?" Trixie was so surprised she almost shouted. "Shh," Honey cautioned. "She might be right behind us." "Why, she's got everything," Trixie continued in a slightly lower voice. "Next to you, Honey, she's the prettiest girl in our class. She doesn't get very good marks, but neither do I. She's got 2 sets of twins for brothers and sisters, and her father made $1 million a couple of years ago. They have a huge place that's as gorgeous as yours, high up on a hill that's even higher than your hill, with a marvelous view of the river. I've only been out there once, but—" "That's the point," Honey interrupted. "Why haven't you been out there more than once? Why doesn't she ever sit near you on the bus? I thought you and Di had known each other since kindergarten." "We have," Trixie said. "And, come to think of it, when the Lynches were poor and lived in a nice but rather crowded apartment on Main Street, she used to invite me home for lunch an awful lot. Her mother is a wonderful cook. I can still remember how yummy her pancakes and fried chicken tasted. Such a treat instead of sandwiches and milk." "Her mother doesn't cook at all anymore," Honey said. "Why should she?" Trixie demanded. "When Di asked me to lunch last spring, that's when I saw their red trailer. The whole place was simply swarming with servants. 2 nurses for the twins, if you can believe it. I wish Bobby had 2 nurses. He could use them." Bobby was Trixie's mischievous 6-year-old brother, and more often than she liked, Trixie had to take her turn keeping an eye on him. Honey smiled. "You think you'd like a lot of servants, Trixie, but you wouldn't. I was brought up by nurses, and I can tell you it's no fun." "But the nurses don't bother Di," Trixie objected. "And the lucky duck never has to wash dishes or dust or make beds the way I do on weekends." "Poor, overworked you." Honey's hazel eyes twinkled with laughter. "I happen to know that Brian and Mart do most of the dishwashing at your house, and everyone but Bobby makes his own bed. And as for all that dusting, well, I've seen you do it, Trixie. A lick and a promise is the only way to describe that chore of yours. If you find a spot you can't blow off a tabletop, you put something on top of it." Trixie chuckled. "You're right, Honey. I'd hate to have a lot of servants cluttering up our place, and nobody could possibly cook as well as Mom's does. The funny part of it is that she never makes a big fuss about it either. When she dons an apron, she looks younger and prettier than ever, and she sort of wanders into the kitchen and wanders out again with an enormous meal." "How do you know Di doesn't feel the same way about her mother?" Honey asked. "I mean, my mother can't boil water without burning it, and so she never wanders into our kitchen. The other day, Miss Trask told her we needed a new spider, and Mother screamed because she thinks all spiders are black widows the way I used to." Honey giggled. "It took hours for Miss Trask to explain that the spider was a frying pan." Trixie giggled too. Honey's parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents had been born rich, so it didn't surprise Trixie to learn that Mrs. Wheeler was probably almost as much afraid of a frying pan as she was of a spider. Honey was most likely the first girl in the family for a long time who would care to learn how to cook. "What did Di say to you?" Trixie asked curiously after a moment. "I didn't realize that you two were good friends. How can you be sure that she is unhappy?" "She never told me she was lonely," Honey said as they started down the wide front steps of the school. "But I was a new girl when we started school and would have been miserably lonely if it hadn't been for you, Trixie. That's how I happened to notice that Di was miserable. And yet, she isn't a new girl. Haven't you noticed? She hardly ever joins in any fun and seldom speaks to the other boys and girls in our class." Trixie said nothing. Kind-hearted Honey always seemed to notice when people were unhappy. Conscience-stricken, Trixie realized now that Di had changed a lot, although gradually, during the last year. She had shiny blue-black hair that flowed around her slim shoulders and violet eyes fringed with thick curly lashes. She was so pretty that she was always the heroine in the grade school plays, although she usually got her lines and words mixed up. But nobody minded, not even the teachers, because Di always laughed when she made a mistake and somehow managed to turn even the most serious play into a comedy. "It's true," Trixie said suddenly. "She never laughs now, and she sort of hunches herself in a corner of the bus as though she were ashamed of something. But why?" "I don't know exactly," Honey said. "I've tried to make friends with her over and over again, but every time I speak to her, she looks more embarrassed than ever. See, there she is now, standing all alone at the bus stop. Can't we do something about her, Trixie?" Trixie didn't have a chance to reply because they were joined then by her brothers and Jim. Brian was 16, a year older than Jim, but they were both juniors because Jim had skipped a grade. Brian had inherited his father's dark eyes and hair. Except that he was 2 inches taller, Mart looked enough like Trixie to be her twin, and they both had their mother's blue eyes and blonde hair. Jim, although not related to the Wheelers, had the same red hair and green eyes that Honey's father had. Mart was 11 months older than Trixie, and often treated her as though she were Bobby's age. He was very fond of big words, too, and because he knew it annoyed Trixie, used them frequently. He greeted his sister now with, "Do my old eyes deceive me? Is that a notebook which you have crammed so unattractively into your skirt pocket? Am I to deduce from this evidence that you plan to spend a small portion of the forthcoming weekend in the pursuit of knowledge?" Trixie gave him a sour look. "The answer to your simple question is yes. We have to write a theme for our English class." Mart made a tent of his hands and rocked back and forth on his heels as though he were a lecturer on a platform. "And what, pray tell, is to be the theme of your theme?" "None of your business," Trixie said. "So?" Mart elevated his sandy eyebrows. "I was about to offer my services for a small fee, $1 to be exact. With my superior knowledge of all the subjects, my extensive vocabulary, and—" We know, Trixie interrupted. "We also know why you wear your hair in that funny-looking crew cut. Your little brain would collapse under the weight of a normal amount of hair." Children, Brian said, grinning. "Must you quarrel from morning to night? It does get a bit dull after a while." Suddenly, Honey reached out her hand and, tucking it in the crook of Di's arm, drew her into the group. "I was just thinking, Di," she said impulsively, "that it would be wonderful if you could spend the weekend with me and Jim. Here comes the bus now, but there's plenty of time for you to go back into the school and telephone your mother. You won't need any clothes. We're just about the same size, and I have loads of jeans and all kinds of T-shirts and sweaters." Di stared at her for a moment without speaking. Then she blurted, "I don't believe it, Honey Wheeler. I don't believe you ever wear sloppy clothes. I'll bet you don't even own a